As we go throughout our days, there are a lot of things that we take for granted are just going to work like they're supposed to. For example, you probably woke up this morning in a house that was warm with a furnace or a heat pump that was keeping you comfortable in spite of what was going on outside. So we woke up this morning trusting that everything was going to work exactly as it's supposed to in houses that were warm because our furnace or our heat pump worked like they were supposed to. You drove here this morning in a vehicle that, well, you didn't really think about, is this going to start? Is the heater going to turn on in my car? Am I going to be able to melt the ice off the windshield? You take for granted that it's going to work. Just about every day at some point, I look at my watch. I never think about, is it going to work? Is the time going to be correct? We take for granted that it's going to, but there's a whole lot that goes on behind the scenes in any one of these systems. Did we get the title slide? Thank you. And so when you look at any one of these systems like a watch, I know exactly what the three hands mean and what those parts of the watch do. But if you take the back off of the watch, you see something like that, and I tell you, I have no idea what any of those specific pieces do. But they're all essential. Because if even one of those disappears, if even one of those stops doing what it's supposed to do or it breaks, it won't keep time anymore. There are all kinds of things that we take for granted, but if something doesn't work as it's supposed to, it can inconvenience us, even though we don't see all of the pieces. And when we look at the church as a body, when we look at God's family, as Javi just read for us a minute ago, God has placed the members right where He wants them. God has created His church, has built the church in such a way that we can strengthen and work with one another for a common purpose. Now, He has built the church to be a unified group, but there we go. I'm sorry? All right, thank you. He's built His church to be a unified family in which we work together for a common purpose. But He's not made us all to be the same. Because being unified doesn't mean that we're all uniform. It doesn't mean that we all have the same gifts and abilities. As a matter of fact, that wouldn't really work too well. If everyone was like me, we would be in big trouble. But thankfully, we have a diverse body within the church, within God's family. But when we look at our culture, we tend to gravitate towards people who are more like us. We look at our social groups. They're made up of people who think the same, who enjoy the same kinds of things, have a similar sense of humor. We tend to gravitate towards people that, at least in some ways, tend to be more like us. And when we look at our society, and particularly in some ways, we can kind of tend to struggle to mix real well with people who aren't like us. We have different views and different ideas and different backgrounds, and when you turn on the news, what you see is there's a lot of fighting because people don't think the same. Don't come at problems with the same solutions or the same ideas. But this struggle to get along with people who think different and act different and come from different backgrounds is not new. When the church was established, and all of a sudden now you have the Jews who have been God's people, and God says it's going to be made up of Jews and Gentiles. Well, there is no shortage of letters in our New Testament that deal with that problem. You see that again and again and again. But if you look over at Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 4, Paul speaks about how God accepts those, and he's dealing in this chapter with things that are matters of opinion. These are not matters of things that are foundational to the faith, like Paul talks about over in Ephesians chapter 4. There's one Lord and one faith and one baptism and a number of different things that we have to agree on that are foundational. Here he deals with things that are matters of opinion. And notice here in Romans 14, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand." God accepts us regardless of where we stand on matters of opinion. Because you see, there are some things that are not a matter of whether we're being faithful to God or not. It's a matter of taste, a matter of preference, a matter of our background. There are some things, as Paul talks about here in Romans chapter 14, that are not essential. And it's okay for the body of Christ to have a diversity on these things. And he specifically says that we are to accept one another in this situation. If you go down a few more verses to there in chapter 14 in verse 13, he says, "Therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way." And so we have there in verse 13 that our goal in that diversity that we have, in those differences that we have, that we need to work not to cause problems for each other, to cause one another to stumble. And as a matter of fact, in that same context, when you get to chapter 15, he says, "Now we who are strong ought to bear with the weaknesses of those who are without strength, and not just to please ourselves. Each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification." The idea is we need to be building one another up, because our goal is to make it to eternity with Jesus Christ. Not to beat one another up because, well, you had a different opinion than me. You approached that problem in a way that was different than I would have. You come from a different background than me. As you see, there are matters of opinion in which we see a diversity in the church. If you go over to the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, in verses 10 and following, the church is designed to be a diverse body, a diverse family of people with different backgrounds, people who have come to Jesus Christ. In Ephesians chapter 2, beginning there in verse 11, that's a typo, but beginning in verse 11, it says, "Therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." So he's addressing those who are Gentiles, and he's saying, here's what you used to be. And now in verse 13, he says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. He himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, that is, Jew and Gentile." Oh, and in the ancient world, that was a real struggle. You talk about religious background clash, you talk about cultural clash on do we observe holidays or not, clash on what kind of things can we eat and can we not eat. You see that all throughout the New Testament, that there was a clash on these things. But Paul says here, in Christ you've been brought near. He is our peace. He made both groups into one. Verse 15, "By abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments, contained in ordinances, so that he himself might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity. He came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have our access in one Spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, He talks there about Jews and Gentiles being fellow citizens, part of the same household, part of the same family. The separation, the division has been taken away. He says you've been brought together in one body, part of one family. Verse 20, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Jews and Gentiles, he talks about there, together in one body. This diverse group of faithful people, he says, are built together as God's dwelling place. The church is called again and again to be unified, to work together for a common purpose. It doesn't mean that all of us individually are the same. It means that we have the same purpose, that we want to share the love of Jesus so that people of all backgrounds, wherever they come from, whatever they've been through, can come to know the Lord, can come to be in relationship with Jesus Christ, who gave his life for all who will come to him. But as we look at our world, it's easy to get caught up in the divisions and the issues. We see that if you go to the book of Galatians in chapter 2. The Apostle Paul writes about how even at one point Peter and Barnabas got caught up in such a thing. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? See, even Peter and Barnabas got caught up whenever there was peer pressure, whenever there was a group of people trying to pull in a direction that was directly in opposition to the truth of the gospel. What that says is we have to be very careful to hold to the truth. To hold to the truth even whenever our desires pull us in another direction. To hold to the truth whenever everyone else wants to go another direction. To hold to the truth when our emotions want to go in another direction. Because it's very easy to get caught up in something that's not consistent with the gospel. We have to recognize that within the Lord's church, within the Lord's family, He's designed us to be diverse. He has designed us to not be like one another precisely so that we can strengthen each other, so that we can carry out that purpose in a better way. The text that Javi read for us earlier is in 1 Corinthians 12, in verses 14 to 26, and I want to look at a couple of specific parts of that. Beginning in verse 14, he says, the body is not one member, but many. If the foot says, because I'm not a hand, I'm not a part of the body, is it for this reason any less a part of the body? And if the ear says, because I'm not a part of the body, and because I'm not an eye, I'm not a part of the body, is it for this reason any less a part of the body? The whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? The whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed the members, each of them, in the body just as He desired. God placed each member where He wants them. Let that sink in for just a minute. When you think about, you may ask the question, why am I located here? Why am I in Puyallup, Washington? Why am I part of this congregation? When we look at the church, we see God's composition, God's construction, God's design. You being placed where you are within the church is not an accident, is what this tells us. And we see that this has always been the case with God's people. When you think back to Old Testament Israel, we think about the things that they went through as they became a nation, as they were given the law, and all of the different jobs that needed to be done. We think about, the important jobs. We think about Moses. He was the leader that led them through the wilderness, that led them out of Egypt and led them through the wilderness. We think about Joshua as the leader who led them into the promised land. We may think about the military leaders that were able to rally the troops and encourage the people to go in and fight. Or on the other hand, we may think about the priests being the ones who had an upfront position in the worship of Israel and offering the sacrifices. Or the others within the tribe of the Levites who would carry the tabernacle and do other sorts of things as they traveled. But I want you to look in Exodus chapter 35 with me. And what we see is that even in some of the positions, some of the jobs that maybe we don't typically think about that are more behind the scenes, God says, I placed this individual there and I gave him this ability for a reason. In Exodus 35, beginning in verse 30, Moses said to the sons of Israel, see, the Lord has called the name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and has filled him with the Spirit of God, and wisdom and understanding and knowledge and all craftsmanship, to make designs for working in gold and silver and bronze, and the cutting of stones for settings, and the carving of wood, to perform in every inventive work. He's put it in his heart to teach. And he goes on to talk about the different physical things that had to be done in the building of the tabernacle. God says, I put my Spirit in him to make the gold designs, and to cut the stones and the wood. We don't usually give a lot of emphasis to that particular job in Israel, but God says, that one's important. That one is essential. God places his people within his family right where he wants them. When Esther found herself in the palace of the Medo-Persian Empire, Queen Esther, there was a threat against the Jews in which Haman was threatening to have all of them taken out because he hated the Jews. And you remember what Mordecai said to Esther there in Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. If the Jews are destroyed, don't think you'll escape being there in the palace. But who knows whether you have attained to royalty for such a time as this. She was placed in the palace for a purpose. She had a specific role to fill. The reason for diversity in the church is to make us stronger. God designed his church, he designed his family to be diverse so that you can do things that I can't, and I can do things that you can't. Because as we go to carry out the purpose that we have of sharing his love, there are people that you can reach that I can't. There are things that each one of us, a role for each one of us to fill in that task, in carrying out that purpose. Now, as we look at the text that was read for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there were a couple of specific issues that are being addressed. One, you've got some who are feeling inferior as they look around at the different spiritual gifts. Some are saying, well, because I'm not that part of the body, because I can't do this or that, I must not be that important. But then there are others that, they've let their ego get the best of them. My gift is the most important. My abilities are the most important. And Paul corrects both of those. All the roles are important, whether they're up front or behind the scenes. Those who are extroverted and can talk to anyone, or those who are very quiet and introverted. We have very different strengths and weaknesses, and very different things that we can do. God has placed each and every one in the church where He desires. God has designed His church to be diverse. We're to be unified, but it doesn't mean that we're all the same. And so what that means is we need to all pursue our part to look for our role within the Lord's church, within God's family, to look for how can I fulfill the purpose that God has for me. It requires a proactive mindset for us to go to this asking the question, what has God gifted me, and what abilities, what resources, what has God handed to me to be able to fulfill His purpose, to be able to strengthen His people, to be able to share His love. You know, often when we think about giftedness, we tend to have more of a reactive than a proactive mindset. You know, we wait until there's a question asked, hey, we need volunteers for this, we need volunteers for that, and well, that's not my gift. But in order for us to be the part that God has called us to do the things that God has called us to, it requires us to have a proactive role. To ask, what can I do? Because there is something that each and every one of us can do that will glorify God, that will help to fulfill the purpose that we have, that will be valuable in the mission. Because as we read in 1 Corinthians 12, God has placed you right where He wants you within His body, right where He wants you within His church. Importance is not about prominence. Sometimes the most important tasks in the moment are the ones that no one sees. There are things that go on here within the church in Puyallup that are incredibly important and valuable that very few actually know about. Things behind the scenes. Importance is not about prominence. You know, we think about if God's going to do His work through someone, or if God's going to show up in some way, it's going to be loud, and it's going to be in your face, and it's going to be, well, when you look in 1 Kings chapter 19, whenever Elijah is there and he was discouraged and God was encouraging him to come back, he sees a fire and he sees an earthquake and there's a wind that's breaking the mountains apart, and God wasn't in any of those. Then Elijah heard the sound of a gentle breeze. And God was right there in that gentle breeze. Sometimes what's needed to reach someone with Christ's love is someone who is gentle and will listen and speak softly. Because when you're dealing with someone who's hurting, the in-your-face approach doesn't work. But then there are other instances where someone needs to be told very directly and clearly. All of us play a different part. All of us have different gifts and abilities. But you see, it's not about how much we've been given or what gifts we do or don't have. What God is looking for is faithfulness to the task. What are we doing with what He's given us? Jesus tells in Matthew 25 the parable of the talents, and He talks about how each one was given according to his ability. Opportunity was given according to their ability. And you have one who was given 5 talents, and he went out and traded, and he got 5 more. And you have one who was given 2 talents, and he went out and traded and gained 2 more. And both of them were later told, well done. Now, the one that had 5 talents was not more faithful than the one with 2. Both of them took what they'd been given, and they used it faithfully. But then there was one who only was given 1 talent, and he was afraid. He went out, and it says in the text that he buried it so that he wouldn't lose it. And the master was angry, called him a wicked and lazy slave because he didn't use what he'd been given faithfully. The problem with the 1 talent servant was not that he only had 1 talent. It was that he didn't use what his master had given him. Faithfulness is not about how much we've been given. It's about how we use what we've been given. In Mark chapter 12, verses 41 to 44, Jesus is there with his disciples in the temple. and they're watching the people go through the activities that are there in the temple, and they're watching people put money into the treasury. And the text tells us there were a whole lot of rich people that came along, and they're dropping huge sums of money into the treasury. And, well, that didn't really impress Jesus too much. He's watching it. But then there was this very poor lady, a widow, who came along, and it says she dropped in 2 small copper coins. And that was the one that got Jesus' attention. That was the one he calls all of his disciples around, and he said, do you see what she's done? Do you see this woman? Do you see her faith? He was paying attention to her, and it made an impact, not because of the amount she dropped in, but because of the attitude and the faith that it took. She gave sacrificially. He said all those others, they gave great, huge amounts from their surplus. She sacrificially gave all that she had. You see a faithfulness in what she gave. Monetarily, it was a very small amount, but it demonstrated a great faith and a great trust in God. Faithfulness is not about the amount we've been given. It's about how we use what God has given to us. And as we read before in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 42, if all you can give is a cup of cold water, Jesus says you'll by no means lose your reward. We need to pursue, proactively look for our part. How can we use what God has given us? What opportunities has He given to us, and how can we use those to glorify Him and to fulfill the purpose of sharing the good news, of sharing His love with those around us? And I want to look at one more passage before we conclude this morning in Romans chapter 12. Another passage that talks about the diversity of gifts within the body of Christ, a diversity of different individuals within the family of God. In Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 6, Paul says, since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith; if service, in his serving; or he who teaches, in his teaching; or he who exhorts, in his exhortation; he who gives with liberality; he who leads with diligence; he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. Now, Paul doesn't say that one of these is more valuable or more important than the others. He says, whichever one of these you have, do it to the best of your ability. Whatever you do, whatever opportunities you have, God calls us to faithfulness within it. So it's a question for each of us to ask is, what abilities and resources and opportunities has God given to me? How can I use that faithfully to glorify Him and to carry out His purpose and His mission? Our purpose, as you see, is to share the love of Jesus so that everyone will know Him. He's blessed us tremendously for the purpose of declaring how great He is, how mighty He is, and how loving He is, and how He's been sacrificial to us and what He's done for us. He's placed you right where He wants you so that that purpose can be carried out. Because God's mission to the world is the same that we read of Jesus in Luke chapter 19. He came to seek and to save that which is lost. God is still about that same purpose, that same mission. And Romans chapter 12 says He has composed the body, placed each member right where He wants them for His purpose, for His glory, according to His love for mankind. It's not an accident that God has put you where you are. But we each need to ask the question, what's my purpose? What's my role in glorifying God and carrying out His purpose and His mission? As part of God's family, we've talked about over the last several weeks, you are loved. You've been given a chance to start over, to have a good standing with God. You are loved as His child. You are celebrated. He is an advocate for you. But what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is that's part of the family of God as one of His children. You are needed. You have an important role to fill. Because souls depend on it. Eternity depends on it for those around us. God has blessed us tremendously in allowing us to be part of His family. In just a minute, we're going to sing an invitation song. If you're not a part of that family, you have the opportunity, by faith in Jesus, to be united with Him in the waters of baptism, to become a child of God. But in becoming a child of God, He calls you to be active in taking part in His mission. If you'd like to become a child of God this morning, we would love to assist you in it. Or if as a child of God you'd like to study and spend time, if you would like encouragement and help in figuring out where do you fit, what is your role, how can you help, we would love to spend time with you and to pray with you, to pray for you, and to study with you and assist you in whatever way we can so that God can be glorified, so that more people can come to know Jesus Christ, so that more people can be saved. If we can assist you this morning, we invite you to come right now while we stand and while we sing.